On a damp, grey morning in May of 1536, a young woman in a dark grey damask gown stepped onto a wooden scaffold inside the walls of the Tower of London. She was 20, 5 days short of her 3rd anniversary as the Queen of England. As she looked out at the silent, watching crowd, she knew the French executioner standing behind her had been ordered from Calais days before she had even been given a trial. Her death was not a sudden act of rage. It was a meticulously scheduled, state-sanctioned murder. We have all been taught the simple nursery rhyme to remember the wives of King Henry VIII: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It is a catchy rhythm, one that paints Henry as a cartoonish, gluttonous monarch who simply tossed women aside when he grew tired of them. But hidden beneath the folklore and the sanitized history textbooks is a far darker, far more terrifying reality. Henry's wives were not merely victims of a fickle heart. They were the targets of psychological warfare, systemic abuse, and calculated legal assassinations orchestrated by the highest powers in the land. The true story of what Henry VIII did to the women who loved him is a masterclass in tyranny, paranoia, and state terror, and the full extent of this calculated brutality is worse than you were ever taught. But to understand the monster, we must first look at the world that forged him, because a reign of terror does not begin with an executioner's sword, it begins with a whisper of fear. In the early 16th century, the English throne was not a comfortable seat. The Tudor dynasty was newly minted, born from the blood-soaked mud of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal, decades-long civil war that had torn the country apart. Henry VIII grew up surrounded by the ghosts of dead kings and the lingering threat of rebellion. The ultimate, absolute necessity for any Tudor king was a male heir. Without a son, the fragile peace of the realm would shatter, plunging England back into the dark ages of civil war. This wasn't just dynastic vanity, it was a matter of national survival. Or at least that was the justification Henry would later use to excuse his unforgivable sins. Everything was about to change. In 1509, a handsome, athletic, and charismatic 18-year-old Henry took the throne. He was not originally meant to be king. His older brother, Arthur, had been the golden child, trained from birth to rule. But Arthur died suddenly at the age of 15, leaving behind his grieving teenage bride, the Spanish Princess Catherine of Aragon. To secure the vital alliance with Spain, Henry did what was expected of him. He married his brother's widow. For years, history tells us they were happy. Catherine was not the door-weeping victim pop culture often portrays. She was a brilliant, highly educated, and fiercely capable woman, the daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the monarchs who had funded Columbus and unified Spain. While Henry was away fighting feudal wars in France, it was Catherine who ruled England as regent. It was Catherine who rallied the English army to brutally crush a Scottish invasion at the Battle of Flodden. She even sent Henry the bloodied coat of the dead Scottish king as a macabre trophy of her victory. She was a warrior queen, universally beloved by the English people. But behind the tapestries of the Tudor court, a quiet tragedy was unfolding, one that would plant the seeds of a profound darkness. The nurseries of the royal palaces remained empty. Year after year, Catherine endured the agonizing heartbreak of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants who lived only a matter of days. Of her 6 documented pregnancies, only 1 child survived infancy, a girl, Princess Mary. In the mind of a 16th century king, a daughter was simply not enough. A woman had never successfully ruled England in her own right. The last time it was attempted, the country descended into anarchy. As Catherine approached her 40s, the biological clock stopped ticking, and a cold, creeping paranoia settled over Henry. He did not look at his wife with sympathy for her grief. He looked at her with suspicion. He began searching his Bible, obsessively poring over the book of Leviticus, where he found a passage stating that if a man takes his brother's wife, it is an impurity, and they shall be childless. Henry's narcissism twisted his reality. He convinced himself that he was not at fault. It was God. God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. The man who had once written passionate love letters to Catherine now saw her as a cursed obstacle blocking his divine right to a son. But no one saw what came next. Henry did not just want a mistress, he wanted a new reality. He demanded that the Pope annul his marriage, effectively erasing 20 years of Catherine's life as queen. He wanted the church to declare that his marriage had never been valid in the first place, rendering his own daughter, Mary, a bastard. But Catherine of Aragon was not a woman who would go quietly into the dark. At a dramatic public tribunal at Blackfriars, facing the most powerful men in the kingdom and the Pope's own representative, Catherine fell to her knees before Henry. In a moment of breathtaking courage, she publicly swore that she had come to him a virgin, that she had never consummated her marriage with his brother Arthur, and she begged for justice. She humiliated Henry in front of the world, and in that moment, Henry's frustration calcified into a vindictive, calculated cruelty. If he could not bend her will, he would break her reality. He banished her from court. He stripped her of her title, ordering that she be referred to only as the Princess Dowager of Wales. He seized her wealth, her jewels, and her properties. But the physical deprivations were nothing compared to the psychological torture he unleashed. Henry knew Catherine's only vulnerability was her daughter Mary. In a masterstroke of cruelty, Henry separated mother and daughter, forbidding them from ever seeing each other again. Even when Catherine lay dying of what we now know was likely heart cancer, she begged Henry just to let her look upon her daughter one last time. Henry coldly refused. He isolated her in cold, damp castles in the countryside, surrounding her with spies, hoping the dampness of the English winters would finish the job his lawyers could not. He slowly suffocated her existence until she died in January 1536, a prisoner in all but name. That decision would alter history forever. To destroy Catherine, Henry had to destroy the world she belonged to. When the Pope refused to grant his annulment, Henry didn't just accept defeat. He tore the entire country away from the Catholic Church. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, sparking the English Reformation. Monasteries were burned, monks were executed, and centuries of religious tradition were obliterated, all to satisfy the ego of one man who believed the rules of heaven and earth did not apply to him. And standing right beside him, fueling the fire of this monumental rebellion, was the woman who had caught his eye, Anne Boleyn. Anne is perhaps the most misunderstood woman in English history. She is often remembered as a seductress, a manipulative schemer who bewitched the king. But the truth is far more complex and ultimately far more tragic. Anne was highly educated, charismatic, deeply religious, and possessed a razor-sharp intellect. When Henry first pursued her, she refused to become his mistress, having seen how easily he discarded women, including her own sister, Mary Boleyn. Anne held out for the crown. She played the most dangerous game in Europe, and for a fleeting moment she won. In 1533, pregnant with what Henry was convinced would be his long-awaited son, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a magnificent ceremony. But her triumph was built on a fragile foundation of glass. The English people despised her, calling her the Great War, loyal as they were to the memory of Catherine. And worse, the child Anne carried was not the promised son. It was a girl, the future Queen Elizabeth I. Henry swallowed his profound disappointment, convincing himself that a healthy girl proved a healthy boy would follow. But the boys did not come. Just as Catherine had suffered, Anne began to miscarry. And with every drop of spilled blood, the atmosphere in the Tudor court grew more venomous. We are told Anne Boleyn died because she could not provide a son, but the actual documents from the era reveal a conspiracy far more sinister. By early 1536, Henry had suffered a severe jesting accident, leaving him unconscious for 2 hours and saddling him with an agonizing, ulcerated leg wound that would plague him for the rest of his life. The golden, athletic prince was dead. In his place emerged a paranoid, volatile tyrant. When Anne miscarried a male child shortly after his accident, Henry's patience snapped. He told a confidant that he had been drawn into the marriage by sortilege, witchcraft. It was a dangerous word. In the Tudor court, the king's passing thoughts were deadly weapons waiting to be picked up by ambitious men. Enter Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was Henry's chief minister, a brilliant, ruthless, self-made man who operated as the king's ultimate fixer. Cromwell and Anne Boleyn had once been allies, pushing forward the religious Reformation together. But power in Henry's court was a zero-sum game, and the two had fiercely clashed over the spoils of the dissolved monasteries. Cromwell knew that if Anne survived her current fall from grace, she would eventually maneuver to have his head. So, Cromwell decided to take hers first. What unfolded over the next few weeks was a masterclass in calculated political destruction. If Henry merely divorced Anne, she would remain a powerful, polarizing figure, much like Catherine. She could rally Protestant allies in Europe. She could contest the legitimacy of any future children Henry had. No, Henry and Cromwell didn't just need Anne removed, they needed her obliterated. They needed her destroyed so utterly that no one would ever dare speak her name in defense. The charges Cromwell engineered were not just treason, they were meticulously designed to shock, horrify, and entirely strip Anne of her dignity. She was accused of adultery with 5 men, including members of the king's privy chamber. But that wasn't enough. To ensure her complete social and moral annihilation, Cromwell added the charge of incest, accusing Anne of sleeping with her own brother, George Boleyn. It was a staggering, sensational lie. Modern historians universally agree that the charges were entirely fabricated. The dates in the indictments didn't even match reality. On day she was accused of committing adultery in London. Records prove she was miles away in Greenwich. But facts did not matter in a Tudor courtroom where the verdict had been decided before the ink on the arrest warrant was dry. When the verdict was handed down, Anne Boleyn's fate was sealed not by justice, but by the terrifying absolute power of a king who had rewritten the laws of God and man to suit his desires. On that damp May morning in 1536, as the executioner's sword severed the head of the anointed queen, Henry VIII was not mourning in his chambers. He was already looking elsewhere. Just 11 days after Anne's blood soaked the wooden scaffold, Henry stood at an altar and married her lady-in-waiting Jane Seymour. The speed of the marriage was a chilling testament to Henry's detachment. To the court, it was a terrifying message: no one was indispensable, and the king's will was a force of nature that could annihilate anyone in its path. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed Jane Seymour had solved the impossible puzzle of Henry Tudor. She was the antithesis of Anne, submissive, quiet, and seemingly uninterested in the lethal game of court politics. But the shadow of her predecessors hung heavy over her. Once, when Jane dared to beg Henry on her knees to show mercy to rebels involved in the Pilgrimage of Grace, Henry's eyes darkened. He coldly warned her to remember the fate of her predecessor, a thinly veiled threat of the executioner's block. Jane never spoke out against him again. She gave Henry the one prize he had dismantled his kingdom to acquire: a living, breathing son, Prince Edward. But the triumph was fleeting. 2 weeks later, Jane was dead from a postpartum infection. Henry enshrined her in his memory as his only true wife, largely because she possessed the one trait Henry ultimately required of all women. She died before he had the chance to grow tired of her. But no one saw what came next. The kingdom was thrown back into the precarious marriage market. But this time, the whispers across the courts of Europe were different. Foreign diplomats wrote home warning that the English king was a monster, a Leviathan who devoured his brides. When Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, finally secured a political alliance by arranging a marriage with the German Princess Anne of Cleves, the stage was set for a disastrous collision of expectation and reality. Henry fell in love with a flattering portrait, but when he met Anne in person, he was profoundly repulsed. He famously declared, "I like her not," and the machinery of the Tudor court immediately shifted gears from wedding planning to character assassination. Cromwell, the architect of Anne Boleyn's demise, now found himself caught in the very trap he had helped design. Henry's humiliation over the unconsummated marriage turned into a festering rage. He demanded an exit. Anne of Cleves, however, possessed a brilliant survival instinct. Watching the terrifying political maneuvering around her, she recognized that fighting Henry meant death. When his lawyers came to her with demands for an annulment, she didn't scream, she didn't fight, and she didn't demand justice. She quietly agreed to step aside, accepting the title of the king's beloved sister. She traded a lethal crown for a life of immense wealth and independence, surviving the tyrant by entirely neutralizing his ego. But a blood sacrifice was still required to soothe Henry's wounded pride. Cromwell, the loyal servant who had ripped the country apart for his master, was dragged to the Tower and beheaded. The monster had eaten its maker. Everything was about to change. In the immediate aftermath of Cromwell's brutal execution, Henry's eye fell upon a girl who would become the ultimate victim of his court's systemic abuse. Her name was Catherine Howard. She was a teenager, no older than 19, thrust into the bed of a man who was now approaching 50. Henry was no longer the golden prince of his youth. He was morbidly obese, tyrannical, and plagued by a foul-smelling, oozing leg ulcer that had to be kept open and drained daily. Catherine was a pawn, dangled in front of the king by her ambitious aristocratic family to secure their own power. Henry called her his rose without a thorn, utterly oblivious to the tragic, deeply compromised childhood she'd endured before coming to court. Catherine was young, foolish, and desperately out of her depth in a court crawling with spies. When her past indiscretions and a clandestine relationship with a courtier named Thomas Culpeper were uncovered, the reaction was not merely one of marital betrayal. It was an explosion of state-sanctioned terror. When the Archbishop of Canterbury slipped a letter into Henry's hand detailing Catherine's sins, the king reportedly broke down in tears. But the tears of a tyrant quickly curdle into a demand for blood. The retaliation was apocalyptic. The terrifying machinery of Tudor treason laws was unleashed upon a frightened teenager. Catherine was dragged from her chambers, screaming and weeping so violently that her frantic run down the haunted gallery of Hampton Court Palace is still spoken of today. She was locked away, interrogated until she was practically out of her mind with terror. The men involved were tortured and executed, their heads spiked on London Bridge. As Catherine awaited her own death in the Tower, she asked for the wooden executioner's block to be brought to her cell. In the dark, cold stone room, the teenage queen spent the night before her execution practicing how to lay her head upon the wood. It is an image of such profound, agonizing psychological torment that it strips away any lingering romance of the Tudor era. She was executed the next morning. That decision would alter history forever. By the time Henry married his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, the court was a paranoid, claustrophobic labyrinth where one wrong word meant the agonizing death of a traitor. Catherine Parr was not a virgin bride. She was a wealthy, twice widowed intellectual who served more as a nursemaid and companion than a romantic conquest. But even she could not escape the calculated brutality of the king. When she dared to debate theology with Henry, challenging his religious supremacy, just a fraction too far, conservative enemies at court pounced. They convinced the ailing, irritable king that his wife was a heretic. Henry signed her arrest warrant, but Catherine Parr possessed something the others did not, the benefit of hindsight. Tipped off by a dropped piece of paper, she realized the executioners were coming for her. In a masterstroke of survival, she rushed to Henry's chambers, threw herself at his feet, and convinced him that she had only debated him to distract him from the pain in his leg, and to be instructed by his superior divine wisdom. Her total, abject submission stroked his towering narcissism just enough to save her life. When the guards arrived to arrest her the next day, Henry beat them away. She had survived by the skin of her teeth, understanding that to live alongside Henry VIII, one had to entirely erase their own autonomy. When Henry V finally died in his massive custom-built bed in January 1547, he left behind a fractured kingdom, bankrupt and spiritually deeply divided. He believed he had secured his legacy with his fragile son Edward, who would reign for only 6 short years before dying of illness. But history has a dark sense of humor, and the ultimate climax of Henry's obsession with a male heir is perhaps the greatest irony in European history. After Edward's death, the crown did not pass down a long line of Tudor kings. Instead, it was seized by Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the woman Henry had discarded and mentally tortured. And when Mary died, the throne passed to the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry had decapitated. Queen Elizabeth I would go on to rule for 45 years, presiding over a golden age that Henry could only have dreamed of. The men Henry desperately desired failed to carry his legacy. It was the daughters of his victims who ultimately built the British Empire. We look back at Henry VIII through the safe lens of distance, turning his reign into a morbid soap opera of gowns, banquets, and